Hi, it's Isabel, A Curious Tale. Welcome back to my channel. I've spoken about some tarot decks here before, but today I want to do a sort of mini book review, which will be my first. The book is Lessons from the Mountaintop by Lawrence Pintak, and I just finished it. The book has just been released in the UK and it was also recently released in the US. So it can be ordered from local bookshops or wherever you like to buy your books. Firstly, I just want to mention that the beautiful cover art was done by my husband BJ, and I'll put his Instagram and Lawrence's Instagram, both of them there, so you can find out more about the author of this wonderful book and of course the cover artist. So Lawrence Pintak is a family friend of mine, but when I was reading the book, I obviously tried to approach it just taking it on its own and not bringing in what I know about this inspiring person. But yeah, I would think I wanted to recommend this book for anyone who is interested in eclectic spirituality and finding a way to honor different traditions and embrace different ways of exploring mysticism without kind of falling into the trap of staying in the shallow waters. And this is something this book goes into with a lot of different chapters. So before I get ahead of myself, I will just give a quick introduction to the book. The book follows a group of different individuals who all follow a sort of mystical approach to spirituality. By that I mean one where they have deep insight, they have very developed practices that often they've been going into for decades, and some of them focus on one spiritual tradition, but others bring together different spiritual traditions, either together in their own practice or by honouring both in different ways. So the first chapter goes into the life of a Sufi sheikh and speaks about Sufi practices, and this is something I didn't know a lot about, so I found that really, really interesting. This is Shams Frieslander, who is from America but became very well respected in Turkey in the global Sufi tradition. So it was really great to learn about a spiritual practice that I'm definitely not an expert in. And in this, I would like to mention that I think one thing that makes the book quite unique is that Lawrence has a background in journalism, especially like broadcasting and covering events and political changes in the Middle East. And so I think that he brings that journalistic approach that we don't always find in spiritual books, and I think that's quite a unique combination because he is someone that has himself a very developed spiritual practice, but he doesn't speak about his own practice in this book. But I feel like the way that he speaks about other people's practices and clearly has a strong understanding of them, I think that that's a product of the fact that he himself is someone who probably could have been included in this book in his own chapter, but chooses to focus on the subjects. And I think this journalistic background, I think because he's profiled, leaders of countries and a wide array of political figures, I think that what it does is each chapter, in my opinion, has a very distinct energy that I feel is the energy of the person coming through. And that to me was really interesting, that I got very strong feelings from each chapter of a very strong feeling of how these people might be or what their energy might be like, which is quite different from one another, obviously, because they have very different backgrounds. And although, as we'll see in the book, a lot of the conclusions that these mystics come to, despite the fact that their traditions are so varied, there's a lot of similarities in their sort of overall conclusions that they found. But you can still get really different feelings of their energies or what their personalities might be like, almost like you've met them from each chapter. So I think that's really interesting and quite different to what I've seen in different books on spirituality from various traditions. So the second chapter is Michael Holloran, and he is a Christian and Zen Buddhist practitioner and spiritual leader. So that was so interesting. Just also hearing how the Catholic Church that he is a part of, I believe Catholic, has been very accepting of his development within Zen Buddhism, and how he himself sees the two wisdom streams as being complementary, in that their sort of ultimate truth is the same, even if the methods and ways of explaining it are quite different. So it was so interesting to read about someone who follows and actually teaches on two faiths that we don't normally hear about in the same sentence. And already you can see just the array of traditions covered here. Then we have Ram Alexander and Atmananda, both disciples of Ananda Mayama. So this is a Hindu spiritual teacher, and again following through his journey towards that, and his journey around India. And it was very interesting. Just I felt his Lawrence Pintak definitely has a very good way of not telling you what to think about a person, but painting a very strong image of them, that you can have your own feelings about what they might be like. Of course, understanding that these are just inferences and personal opinions, but still I think the book is really good at giving you an idea about these people. And also just reading about people who, during the 70s, many decades ago, traveled the world, and in many cases went against what was expected of them by society to explore different spiritualities, and just seeing their fearlessness in that way is really interesting. And also at a time when many different spiritual traditions were less, information on them was less widely available in places like the US and the UK, Europe. So that's also a very interesting sort of historical element as well, because obviously now we can still travel and search for things, but I feel like we almost have the opposite problem now. Like, the wealth of information that's out there, it's almost like overwhelm, and then trying to sift through that. Whereas a lot of the people profiled here, when they were going on their spiritual explorations, it was about trying to find the information to begin with, because there was just a dearth of information out there. So that's also interesting. Then this one chapter I found particularly interesting, about Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, a Buddhist nun and teacher, and Nick Rebosch, who played a key role in sort of publishing and bringing a lot of Buddhist knowledge to the US, the UK, Australia, and many places. And again, this the background of this chapter is Buddhism, but there's one part that I felt was particularly interesting, and also sort of summed up for me what this book was sort of saying. So I just wanted to share that. So Tenzin Palmo, she she said this: the analogy of walking up a mountain is useful because you go to the north face or the south face or the east face, west face, and everybody's walking up the same mountain, but we don't recognize it because the scenery is very different. Very, very few people actually get to the top and get a 360-degree view. But even if they do, they're going to come down the same way they went up. So therefore, they're not going to recognize that other paths would actually lead there too. So I think that's really interesting. That echoes a lot of what I feel as well, just from my own experience and from what I've seen in others, that all these different spiritualities, they all have value, and it's not about finding the right one and saying this is the correct one, the others are wrong, and now I know. It's about recognizing that they all have such potential for personal realization, but it's about finding the path that suits you and that you're going to resonate with, and therefore that's going to help you develop. So I think that's a really wonderful way that she put it, and I think this is very much encapsulating the message of the book. And then again, another really interesting point about how, you know, as I've said, there's just so many spiritualities available to us now that sometimes it can be this feeling of overwhelm. They all seem so interesting, but you don't have time in one lifetime to become an adept in each one of them. So what do you do? And I thought this was very interesting. I'll just read what Lawrence and Palmer wrote, that in the West these days, many people in search of meaning in their lives become spiritual grazers, sampling the many offerings on the religious landscape. A mindfulness retreat this month, a Sufi summer the next. Palmer believed that while those paths all have the potential to bring their students to a place of realization, that can only happen if one full path is traversed. So the idea that each path has the potential to bring enlightenment or realization, whatever you want to call it, but you sort of have to commit in order to see tangible and long-lasting results. So Palmer herself says, people expect instant results. They learn one meditation, they sit there, nothing happens. They hear somebody is teaching something else, and then they rush off and they start doing that. That's a problem. When you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, you don't have anything central. The example would be if you're in the desert, but you know underneath there's an underground lake. So you're trying to get to the water, and you dig a little hole, but it's still very dry. So you dig another little hole, and then you try another little hole, and in the end, you end up just with a claim full of holes. So I think that's interesting. I myself feel that isn't fully wasted, because let's say you are digging many tiny holes. You haven't reached this great underground lake of knowledge. You haven't perhaps tasted true reality. However, I think you have potentially given more spots from where the water may seep out, or has less distance to travel before it reaches the surface. I don't think, and this is just my personal add-on, that such a practice is necessarily flawed. It could be if you're approaching it from a very sort of consumerist point of this is what I want, and if I don't get it here, I'm just going to go to the next, and just staying superficial. But I do think that if you're approaching it with a pure intent, I do think that there still could be some benefit from digging all these metaphorical small holes, because you are still getting closer, and you never know, maybe that will cause the whole ground to eventually cave in, or maybe that will give the water enough avenues from which to come up and bubble up to the surface. Who knows? I'm not an expert, but I think that I do really like this analogy of at least sticking with one path to be able to get results, and as these people showcase, you don't have to ignore everything else and become very single-minded. You can still interact with other traditions and even incorporate them, but just the idea of committing to perhaps even more than just one spirituality, one particular practice, as many people in this book have done. So I thought that was really interesting, and that part really stuck with me. Then we have a chapter on Jill Hammer titled The Jewish Bard. So someone who has studied a lot of Jewish mystical traditions and is very committed to showing the sort of feminine aspect of that, which isn't always or hasn't traditionally been honoured. So that was a really interesting chapter. And then Vedanta, Swami Admarupananda, in the very all-encompassing and welcoming tradition of Vedanta, and going to very much focusing again on what is at the roots of the universe. And again, this is a chapter where we hear about someone who really dedicated decades to their practice, and a lot of these people have gone through hardship in one way or another, and seeing how that has shaped their practice. And another thing that interested me is when you see profiles of people who might be in their 60s or 70s, they might sort of speak of a 5-year period in a passing sentence, as in, oh, and I was doing that for 7 years, and then I did this, and that just really puts things in perspective, that when you do, as we will hopefully get to the age of 70, you can look back, and a period of time will of course be significant, but it will be just a small part of a much longer journey, which I think can also be quite comforting, because it shows that even these people that are very spiritually adept, and they've reached great realizations, and in many ways they've been had a real impact on their chosen spirituality on the global stage. They may still have periods of 5 years where they were having difficulties, or had to do something different for practical reasons, and that didn't stop them from getting to where they are today. So I think that's a very interesting takeaway. Then we have Emma Restel-Orr, who was very central to the Druid movement, and now sort of has, in her words, moved beyond that into a different sort of spirituality that isn't tied to any one tradition. And that was a very interesting read as well. Again, it goes into the ideas of perception, of she does a lot of death doula work as well, so that was interesting. And then Clear Grace Dayananda, who's self-titled The Travelling Nunc, as in monk and nun together, which is again really, really interesting to see someone who has taken their Buddhist spirituality and really focused on the idea of giving back and uplifting people who aren't always recognized or given the same opportunities in that spirituality. In this case, in the US, focusing on not only people who have economic disadvantages, but also people from different backgrounds, such as people of color, who Buddhism has often in the Western sort of Western Buddhism, which can be quite how to put it, like often in sanghas it might be majority of white people, and then these people are talking about non-dualism, about bodhicitta, about understanding, but they are not understanding the dynamics at play in their sangha, they might be creating an atmosphere where people of colour, people from different backgrounds or perhaps sexualities or gender identities may not feel welcome, either on purpose or more likely just through their lack of trying to understand or prioritizing this kind of understanding. And I thought it's really interesting to hear the perspective of someone within the Buddhist community who is really focusing on these practitioners who don't always have a voice or might not always be understood. And of course, they completely deserve to be. So I think that is a really, it's just a wonderful way of taking Buddhist teachings and putting them into practice in a very brave way, often spending time with homeless people or unhoused people and traveling the country, and now setting up a Sangha, I believe, in Louisiana. So that's really, again, an insight into someone I hadn't heard of, and is very inspiring. And again, this is a really wonderful quote, that when we take our last breath, what's important is this: have we been true to ourselves? That's what I aspire to be, free of self, free of differentiated mind, to be loved and to see all beings. If this is the last breath, already more than enough has been done. So that is, just a great perspective. And I think sometimes spirituality can be criticized, sometimes rightly so, for being very cerebral, talking about things, thinking about things, and it's all well and good, you could say, to pray to end suffering, but it makes sense that you would back it up with actions in the real world, because even if, as Buddhist philosophy would tell us, suffering itself is a construct and it is all illusion, those who are in samsara and are suffering, they feel they're suffering, and it's sort of irrelevant for the person suffering whether or not it is, in quote marks, real, if that will not help them on a practical level. And having that understanding of, yes, it's important to go beyond concepts and seek personal realization and seek realization for the collective, it's also very important to do things, do practical things, and actually help people in the physical realm as well. And that can sometimes be, it can be harder, and so that can really show putting your realizations into practice. So I thought that was a very interesting chapter, and something that is very relevant for the spiritual community, especially the online spiritual community today. And then the end of the book has a chapter called Lessons. So it's sort of picking out the common threads in these people's experiences. And again, you don't want to reduce all this wealth of spiritual traditions to saying, oh, there's just this one or two, they're all similar. Of course they're not similar, and there are many differences throughout the philosophies, the ways of seeing things, what is ultimate reality is very different for different people in their different traditions. However, it is striking how many the realizations that have come from, be it meditating in a cave or taking part in ceremonies with many people together, or just becoming very knowledgeable about mystical traditions. All of this has led very much so to realizations that are quite similar, and that is not only very interesting but quite affirming and positive as well. And I don't want to obviously share all of these lessons, because I think it's very valuable to read the book, and then as you're reading you'll probably be struck by these same continuities, and then again when you read it at the end of the chapter, that's sort of affirmed. But definitely the sense of, one says, all roads lead to the mountaintop, and we are more than our tiny ego. This experience or this idea of a shared human experience is reflected in these mystics' own experiences and teachings, and I think that the book is very interesting for first looking at their background and then also just sharing these tenets that at the end do happen to be very similar to each other. And again, that's not to take away from the wealth or importance of different traditions. As Palmo said, it may be very important to actually follow and really dedicate yourself to one tradition to reach these realizations, but it's very interesting that you can have people all around the world from different backgrounds, and then at the end of the day, a lot of what they've understood from their practice has a lot of common threads. So I thought that is very interesting and a very positive takeaway as well, because it really suggests that there should be no need for division or animosity amongst different spiritual traditions. And of course, these usually come from power struggles. Power corrupts, and whenever things get very organized, the opportunities for power and therefore corruption are obviously heightened. But I think it's a refreshing insight into different people's lives, different people's realizations, and again, I think it's a very engaging read, and you do feel like you've almost had a cup of tea with everyone featured in this book. So that's just my thoughts and sharing a little bit about this book, Lessons from the Mountaintop. Please let me know if you've read it or if you plan to read it. I can give it my full recommendation. So yeah, and let me know if I should talk about other books specifically on my channel, because I did really enjoy just sharing my thoughts. And I've done that about tarot decks, and in those videos I sort of mentioned books that I think the decks could be used together with. This makes me think I should I should think about which tarot deck I would pair this book with as a reverse of what I normally do. And the first deck that's coming to mind is the Ritual Tarot by Tiara May, because it showcases imagery from all different spiritual traditions put together in a very thoughtful, respectful, eclectic and aesthetically beautiful way. Then of course I will be personally using it with my tarot deck, the Purnima Tarot, and perhaps which other decks, maybe the Weaver's Oracle, because again I think that's an oracle deck that isn't set on one spiritual tradition. You could really approach it from whatever background you choose, and it's almost like each woman in this deck could be one of someone who could be profiled in a chapter in this book. When you read the wonderful guidebook, I think that's the feeling I get anyway. So of course I could ramble about tarot decks all day, but you can probably hear that siren, so I think that's telling me it's time to wrap it up. So thank you for watching my review, and yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book as well. I hope to see you again soon. I have some videos planned, so yeah, I hope you're having a wonderful day or evening wherever you are, and yeah, see you again soon. Bye!